Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. Welcome to Bud Mouse. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting history. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Okay, did you like the new intro? We worked hard on it, so hopefully you do. Ready? Here comes our shout out. 1, 2, 3, shout out time. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend, Makeup Mom and Son, and it says, I'm a proud mom who loves monthly subscriptions, unboxing, mystery boxes, makeup tutorials, giveaways. I do makeup on Mondays. I have Wacky Weird Wednesdays, try a new gadget. So check her out, like, share, comment, let her know we sent you by, and have a good day. Enjoy the video. It's history. There will be a test. Pop quiz. Win? We don't know. Oh, go for it, Randy Travis.
This is Joe, the bearded one for the Bud Files, and we're going to be putting this up December the 7th. And for most of you that know a bit about history, the date kind of stands out in a lot of people's minds. This was the date that Japanese and their Imperial Navy launched a surprise attack on our naval base on the territory of Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. Now, this attack occurred at 7:48 a.m., right before 8 a.m., on a Sunday, catching just about everybody off guard because at this time the United States was considered neutral. Interestingly enough, things had been on a slow simmer, to put it mildly. They had ideas that there might be attacks, since the 1920s. Japan had been getting a little antsy due to the fact that they'd used territorial and military expansion in the Pacific and Asia in the late 1890s, annexation of Hawaii, the Philippines, and they were feeling that America was expanding too close to their sphere of influence. It's a fun way to say you're in our neighborhood. Well, anyway, what really started getting things going for tensions, Japan started this happy expansion project. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria. Then there was an expansion into China, leading to the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Now, Japan spent considerable effort trying to isolate China and endeavored to secure enough independent resources to attain victory on the mainland. There was also a southern operation designed to assist these efforts. There was an incident in 1937 in December when the Japanese attacked a U.S. ship. What was known as the Allison Incident, the USS Panay, and then the Nanking Massacre kind of swung Western public opinion against Japan. Well, the U.S. unsuccessfully proposed a joint action with the British to blockade Japan. And in 1938, following an appeal by President Roosevelt, U.S. companies stopped providing Japan with implements of war. Well, Japan in 1940 invaded French Indochina, attempting to stymie the flow of supplies to reach China. And on this, the United States halted shipments of airplanes, parts, machine tools, and aviation gasoline to Japan, the latter perceived as an unfriendly act. Now, interestingly enough, the United States did not stop oil exports, however, partially because the prevailing sentiment in Washington that the Japanese dependence on American oil, such an action would likely to be considered extreme provocation. Well, about mid-1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president, moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii and also ordered a military buildup in the Philippines, taking both actions in a hope of discouraging Japanese aggression in the Far East.
That worked well.
Yeah, because the Japanese high command was mistakenly certain any attack on the United Kingdom's southern Asian colonies, including Singapore, would bring the U.S. into the war. A devastating preventive strike appeared to be the only way to prevent American naval interference. An invasion of the Philippines would also be considered necessary by the Japanese war planners. The U.S. War Plan Orange envisioned defending the Philippines with an elite force of 40,000 men. This option was never implemented due to opposition from Douglas MacArthur, who felt he would need a force 10 times that size. Well, by 1941, U.S. planners expected to abandon the Philippines at the outbreak of war. Later that year, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet, was given orders to that effect. Now, the U.S. finally ceased the oil exports to Japan in July of 1941, following the seizure of the French Indochina after the fall of France, in part because of the new American restrictions on domestic oil consumption. Because of this action, Japan proceeded to take the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Now, two things to realize here. Okay, Japan has already gone into Manchuria, China, French Indochina, and was planning on going after the Dutch East Indies. So Japan was already kind of like acting like, well, Nazi Germany. They were gobbling up small things and waiting for America to finally, put their foot down. Well, either that or the British. Well, the British were busy, they're kind of tied up on their island with Germany looking at them, but what we wound up getting to see was that on August 17th, Roosevelt warned Japan that America was prepared to take opposing steps if neighboring countries were attacked. Now, Japan was faced with this dilemma: either withdraw from China and lose face, or seize new sources of raw materials to the resource-rich European colonies of Southeast Asia. Japan, to its record, was never a major, what do you want to call it, a resource-rich country. They're an island. A lot of their stuff, we gave them. Scrap metal. Like we were just mentioning, oil. A lot of these things was what was keeping the country busy. We basically fed them.
I almost was going to say afloat.
Yeah.
Kept them afloat.
Literally. One other thing that, eventually would bear a strong hitting home effect was, you fast forward X number of months when Midway happened. After we did a number on their aircraft carriers, all of a sudden Japan, they couldn't replace their aircraft carriers that they lost. Over here in America, we were popping them out like we were, building board games. It was about that bad. But yeah, for the major part, Japan was not really a major resource-rich country. That's why they had to keep expanding and growing to try to become, independent of American aid, Chinese supplies. They needed those other lands. They needed the population base. Granted, when they went into China, they also were quite brutal to the civilians and stuff. But that's because that's the way that they wanted to prove themselves as superior. Well, Japan and the U.S. started engaging in negotiations in 1941, attempting to improve the relations. In the course of these negotiations, Japan offered to withdraw from most of China and Indochina after making peace with the nationalist government. It also proposed to adopt an independent interpretation of the Tripartite Pact and to refrain from trade discrimination, provided all other nations reciprocated. Now, Washington rejected these proposals. The Prime Minister of Japan, Minister Konoye, then offered to meet with Roosevelt, but Roosevelt insisted on reaching an agreement before any meeting. the U.S. ambassador to Japan, repeatedly urged Roosevelt to accept the meeting, warning that it was the only way to preserve the conciliatory Konoye government and peace in the Pacific. However, his recommendation was not acted upon. The Konoye government collapsed the following month, and the Japanese military rejected a withdrawal of all troops from China. Now, Japan's final proposal, delivered on November 20th, offered to withdraw from southern Indochina and refrain from attacks in Southeast Asia so long as the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands supplied 1 million U.S. gallons of aviation fuel, lifted the sanctions against Japan, and ceased aid to China. Well, the American counter proposal, 6 days later, commonly referred to as the Whole Note, required Japan completely evacuate China without conditions and conclude non-aggression pacts with the Pacific powers. Now, on November the 26th, that same day in Japan, the day before the note's delivery, a Japanese task force left port. Its destination was going to be Pearl Harbor. Well, Japan, for their efforts, had intended this attack to be a preventive action to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military actions in the Southeast Asia against overseas territories in the UK, the Netherlands, and the United States. Over the course of 7 hours, there were coordinated attacks from the Japanese on U.S.-held actions in the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and on the British Empire in Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Now, additionally, from the Japanese viewpoint, it was seen as a preemptive strike before the oil gauge ran empty. Kind of makes sense. They were trying to do as much as they could with what little they had left. But preliminary planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor to protect the move into the southern resource areas, Japanese term for the Dutch East Indies and Southeast Asia generally, began very early in 1941 under the auspices of Admiral Izakuro Yamamoto, then commanding Japan's Combined Fleet. He won assent to formal planning and training for an attack from the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff only after much contention with naval headquarters, including a threat to resign his command. Full-scale planning was underway early spring of 1941, primarily by Rear Admiral Renosuke Kusaka, an assistant from Captain Minoru Genda, and Yamamoto's Deputy Chief of Staff, Captain Kimito Kirishima. These planners studied the 1940 British air attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto intensively. These guys were studying the acts of war while our guys were busy polishing the ships sitting in harbors. Over the next several months, pilots were trained, equipment was adapted, intelligence was collected. Despite these preparations, Emperor Hirohito did not approve the attack plan until November 5th, after the third of 4 imperial conferences called to consider the matter. Final authorization was not given by the emperor until December the 1st, after the majority of Japanese leaders advised him that the Whole Note would destroy the fruits of China's incident, endangered Manchukuo, and undermine Japanese control of Korea. Well, by late 1941, many observers believed that the hostilities between the United States and Japan were imminent. A Gallup poll, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, found that 52% of Americans expected war with Japan, while 27% did not. 21% had no opinion. Well, the U.S. Pacific bases and facilities have been placed on alert on many occasions. The U.S. officials doubted Pearl Harbor would be the first target. Instead, they expected the Philippines to be hit first. This presumption was due to the threat that the air bases throughout the country and the naval base at Manila posed to sea lanes, as well as supplies and shipments to Japan from territory to the south. They also incorrectly believed that Japan was not capable of mounting more than one major naval operation at a time.
That was a stupid assumption.
Yeah. And Japan's attack had several major arms, as we had mentioned earlier. The first was to destroy the American naval fleets, thereby preventing the Pacific Fleet from entering interfering with the Japan conquest of the Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, and enabling Japan to conquer Southeast Asia without interference. Second, it hoped to buy time for Japan to consolidate its position and increase its naval strength before shipbuilding authorized by the 1940 Vinson-Walsh Act erased any chance of victory. Third, to deliver a blow to the Americans' ability to mobilize its forces in the Pacific, battleships were chosen as the main targets since they were the prestige ships of the Navy at the time. Finally, they hoped that the attack would undermine American morale, such as the U.S. government would drop its demands contrary to Japanese interests and would seek a compromise peace with Japan. Basically, they were hoping that by making the attack, we would sue for peace and not enter war.
That went well.
Yeah.
Who thought that brilliant idea? They need to be fired.
Yeah, well, striking the Pacific Fleet at the anchor at Pearl Harbor also carried two distinctive disadvantages. The target ships would be in a very shallow water, so it would be relatively easy to salvage and possibly repair them. And most of the crews would survive the attack since there were many who were on shore leave or would be rescued from the harbor. A further important disadvantage was the absence from Pearl Harbor of all three of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga.
Because they were doing more important things?
They were just out of the bay.
Oh, okay.
They're out of harbor. Now, the Imperial Japanese Navy Top Command was attached to Admiral Mahan's decisive battle doctrine, especially that of destroying the maximum number of battleships. Despite these concerns, Yamamoto decided to press ahead. Japan's confidence was their ability to win a short war, also meant that other targets in the harbor, especially the Navy Yard, oil tank farms, and the submarine base, were ignored since their thinking the war would be over before the influence of these facilities could be felt. Well, on November 26, 1941, the Japanese task force, consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shikoku, and the Zukoku, departed from Japan in the Kuril Islands en route to a position northwest of Hawaii and intending to launch 408 aircraft to attack the Pearl Harbor, 360 for the 2 attack waves and 48 on defensive combat air patrol, including 9 fighters from the first wave. This first wave was to be the primary attack, while the second wave was to attack carriers as its first objective and cruisers as the second, with battleships as the third attack target. The first wave carried most of the weapons designed to attack capital ships, mainly specially adapted Type 91 aerial torpedoes. Now, these were designed with a unique extension, an anti-roll mechanism and rudder that would allow them to operate in shallow water. Originally, we felt that torpedoes wouldn't be effective inside that harbor because it was so shallow. Well, the aircrew was ordered to select the highest value targets, battleships and aircraft carriers, or, if these were not present, any other high-value ships, cruisers and destroyers. First wave bombers were to attack ground targets. Fighters were ordered to strafe and destroy as many parked aircraft as possible to ensure they did not get into the air to intercept bombers, especially in the first wave. When the fighters' fuel got low, they would refuel the aircraft carriers and then return to combat. Fighters were to serve civil air patrol duties as needed, especially over the U.S. airfields. Before the attack commenced, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched reconnaissance float planes from the cruisers Chikuma and Tone, one to scout over Oahu and the other over Lahaina Roads, Maui, respectively, with orders to report of the U.S. fleet composition and location. Reconnaissance aircraft flights risked alerting the U.S. and were not necessary. U.S. fleet composition and preparedness information on Pearl Harbor was already known due to the reports of the Japanese spy Teiko Yoshikawa. A report of the absence of the U.S. fleet in Lahaina anchorage off Maui was received from Tony's float plane and fleet submarine I-72. Another 4 scout planes patrolled the area between the Japanese carrier force, Kudabutai and Naihu, to detect any counterattack. Fleet submarines, the I-16, I-18, I-20, I-22, and I-24 each, embarked with a Type A midget submarine for transport to the waters off Oahu. The 5 I-boats left Curry Naval District on November 25th, and on December 6th they came within 19 kilometers or 12 miles of the mouth of Pearl Harbor and launched their midget subs at about 1 o'clock in the morning on December 7th. At 3:42 Hawaiian time, the Minesweeper Condor spotted a midget submarine periscope southwest of the Pearl Harbor entrance and alerted the destroyer Ward. The midget may have entered Pearl Harbor, however, Ward sunk another midget submarine at 6:37. This was the first American shots in the Pacific Theater. A midget submarine on the north side of the Ford Island missed the seaplane tender Curtis with her first torpedo and missed the attacking destroyer Monhegan with the other one before being sunk by the Monhegan at 8:43. A third midget submarine, the HA-19, grounded twice, once outside the harbor entrance and again on the east side of Oahu, where it was captured on December 8th. Ensign Kazu Sakamaki swam ashore and was captured by the Hawaii National Guard, Corporal David Akui, becoming the first Japanese prisoner of war. A fourth had been damaged by a depth charge attack and was abandoned by its crew before it could fire its torpedoes, and it was found outside the harbor in 1960. Japanese forces received a radio message from a midget submarine at 41 minutes after midnight on December 8th, claiming to damage one or more large warships inside Pearl Harbor. Now, interestingly enough, in 1992, 2000, and 2001, Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory submersibles found the wreck of the fifth submarine lying in 3 parts outside Pearl Harbor. The wreck was in the debris field where much surplus U.S. equipment had been dumped after the war, including vehicles and landing craft. Both the torpedoes were missing. This correlates with reports that 2 torpedoes fired at the light cruiser St. Louis at 10:04 at the entrance of Pearl Harbor, and possibly a torpedo fired at the destroyer Helm at 8:21. Well, the attack, interestingly enough, took place before any formal declaration of war made by Japan, but this was not Admiral Yamamoto's intention. He originally stipulated that the attack should not commence until 30 minutes after Japan had informed the United States that peace negotiations were at an end. However, the attack began before such notice could be delivered. Tokyo, Tokyo.
Somebody didn't get the memo.
We didn't get the time right.
Those calculations are hard when you're doing timeline or time zones.
Well, yeah, especially since this was 07 and when they sent it, it was already 08. This was part of a 5,000-word notification called the 14-part message in 2 blocks to the Japanese embassy in Washington. Transcribing the message took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it on schedule. In the event, it was not presented until more than an hour after the attack began.
He had some trouble decoding it. He had to get out the decoder ring.
Yeah, turn your decoder rings on. Okay, begin. Now here's where it gets interesting. In fact, the U.S. code breakers had already deciphered and translated most of the message hours before it was scheduled to be delivered.
We beat them to it.
Mm-hmm. The final part is sometimes described as a declaration of war, while it was viewed by a number of senior U.S. government and military officials as a very strong indicator negotiations were likely to be terminated and that war might break out at any moment. It neither declared war or severed diplomatic relations. The declaration of war was printed on the front page of Japan's newspapers in the evening edition of December 8th, late December 7th in the U.S., but not delivered to the U.S. government until the day after the attack.
Oops.
For decades, conventional wisdom held...
We declare war! Yeah, we knew that.
Well, yeah, our ships are sitting in the harbor sinking. For decades, conventional wisdom held that Japan attacked without first formally declaring, before breaking diplomatic relations because of the accidents and bumbling and delayed the delivery of the document, hinting at war to Washington in 1999. However, Teiko Iguchi, the professor of law and international relations at International Christian University in Tokyo, discovered documents that pointed to a vigorous debate inside the government over how, and indeed whether, to notify Washington of Japan's intent to break off the negotiations and start the war, including a December 7th entry in the war diary saying, "Our deceptive diplomacy is steadily proceeding towards success." Of this, Iguchi said the diary shows that the Army and Navy did not want to give them any proper declaration of war or indeed prior notice even of the termination of negotiations, and they clearly prevailed. In any event, even if the Japanese had decoded and delivered the 14-part message before the beginning of the attack, it would not have constituted either a formal break of diplomatic relations or a declaration of war. The final 2 paragraphs of the message read, "Thus, the earnest hope of the Japanese government is to adjust Japanese-American relations and to preserve and promote the peace of the Pacific through cooperation with the American government has finally been lost. The Japanese government regrets to have notify hereby the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government, it cannot but consider that it is impossible to reach agreement through further negotiations."
In English, that means we don't want to talk no more?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a long ways of saying that.
Exactly. Now, as things went, as they were mentioned earlier, is that the Japanese force came across in several waves. The first wave consisted of 183 planes launched north of Oahu, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. 6 planes failed to launch due to technical difficulties, and the first attack included 3 groups of planes. Now, the first group, targeting the battleships and aircraft carriers, was 49 Kate bombers armed with 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs organized in 4 sections. 1 failed to launch. 40 B-5N bombers with Type 91 torpedoes, also in 4 sections. Second group, the targets of Ford Island and Wheeler Field, was 51 Aichi Val dive bombers with 550-pound bombers. 3 of these failed to launch. The third group targets at the aircraft at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barbers Point, and Kaneohe was made up of 43 Zero fighters for air control and strafing. Of the 43, 2 failed to launch. Well, as the first wave started approaching Oahu, they were picked up by radar. However, this post was in training mode for months and was not operational. The operators reported the target to Private Joseph P. McDonald, a private stationed at Fort Schaefer's Intercept Center near Pearl Harbor. But Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, a newly assigned officer at the thinly manned Intercept Center, presumed it was a scheduled arrival of 6 B-17 bombers from California. The Japanese planes were approaching from a direction very close, only a few degrees difference from the bombers, and while the operators had never seen a formation as large as this on radar, they neglected to tell Tyler its size. Tyler, for security reasons, could not tell the operators that the 6 B-17s were due, even though it was widely known. Well, as this first wave of planes approached Oahu, they encountered and shot down several U.S. aircraft. At least one of these radioed somewhat incoherent warnings, and from the ships off the harbor entrance were still being processed or awaiting confirmation when the Japanese air assault began at 7:48 Hawaiian time, or 3:18 a.m. December Japanese Standard Time, as kept by the ships of the Kido Butai. With the attack on Kaneohe, a total of 353 Japanese planes reached Oahu in 2 waves. Now, the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers led the first wave, exploiting the first moments of the surprise to attack the most important ships present, the battleships, while the dive bombers started attacking the air bases across Oahu, starting with Hickam Field, the largest, Wheeler Field, and the main Air Force fighter base. 171 planes of the second wave then attacked the Army Air Force's Bellows Field near Kaneohe on the windward side of the island and Ford Island. The only aerial opposition came from a handful of P-36 Hawks, P-40 Warhawks, and some SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise. Well, in the first wave, about 8 of the 49 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs dropped hit their intended battleship targets. At least 2 of these bombs broke up on impact. Another detonated before penetrating an unarmored deck, and one was a dud. 13 of the 40 torpedoes hit battleships, and 4 torpedoes hit other ships. Men aboard the U.S. ships awoke to the sound of alarms, bombs exploding, gunfire, and prompting bleary-eyed men to dress as they ran to the general quarters stations. The famous message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill," was sent from headquarters of Patrol Wing 2, the first senior Hawaii command to respond. The defenders were very unprepared. Ammunition lockers were locked, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip and open in the open to prevent sabotage, guns unmanned. None of the Navy's 5-inch, only a quarter of its machine guns and only 4 of the 31 Army batteries got into action.
Oops.
Despite this low alert status, many of the American military personnel responded effectively during the attack. Ensign Joseph Tassig Jr. aboard the Nevada commanded the ship's anti-aircraft guns and was severely wounded but continued to be on post. Lieutenant Commander F.J. Thomas commanded Nevada in the captain's absence and got her underway until the ship was grounded at 9:10 a.m. One of the destroyers, the Alwyn, got underway with only 4 officers aboard, all ensigns, none with more than a year's sea duty. She operated at sea for 36 hours before her commanding officer managed to get back aboard. Captain Mervyn Benyon, commanding West Virginia, led his men until he was cut down by fragments from a bomb which hit the Tennessee moored alongside. Now, the second wave composition consisted of 171 planes, 54 B-5Ns, 81 D-3As, and 36 A-6Ms, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shikakazu Shimamaki. 4 planes failed to launch due to technical difficulties. This wave and targets also comprised of 3 more groups of planes. The first group, with the 54 B-5Ns armed with 550-pound bombs. 27 were to go after the aircraft and hangars on Kaneohe, Ford Island, and Barbers Point. 27 were to target the hangars and aircraft on Hickam Field. The second group, again looking for aircraft carriers and cruisers, was made up of 78 of the D-3As armed with 550-pound bombs in 4 sections. And the third group was targeting aircraft at Ford Field, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Barbers Point and Kaneohe. 35 were A-6Ms for defense and strafing. Now, the second wave went into 3 groups. One was designed to attack Kaneohe, the rest Pearl Harbor proper. These sections arrived at the attack point almost simultaneously from different directions. Now, 90 minutes after the attack began, the attack was over. 2,008 soldiers were killed and 710 others wounded. 218 soldiers and airmen who were part of the Army prior to the independent United States Air Force in 1947 were killed and 364 wounded. 109 Marines were killed and 69 wounded, and 68 civilians were killed and 35 wounded. In total, 2,403 Americans were killed, 1,143 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. All of the Americans killed or wounded during the attack were legally non-combatants, given that there was no state of war when the attack occurred. Of the American fatalities, nearly half were due to the explosion of Arizona's forward magazine after it was hit by a modified 16-inch shell. Author Craig Nelson wrote that the vast majority of the U.S. sailors killed at Pearl Harbor were junior enlisted personnel. These officers of the Navy all lived in houses, and the junior people were the ones on the boats, so pretty much all the people who died in the direct line of action were very junior people. So most of them, there were about 17 or 18 whose story is told there. Among the notable civilian casualties were 9 fire department firefighters who responded to the Hickam field during the bombing in Honolulu, becoming the only fire department members on American soil to be attacked by a foreign power in history.
Whoops.
Fireman Harry Tucker Lee Pang of Engine 6 was killed near the hangars by machine gun fire from a Japanese plane. Captains Thomas Macy and John Carrera of Engine 4 and Engine 1 respectively died while battling flames inside a hangar after a Japanese bomb crashed through the roof. An additional 6 firefighters were wounded from Japanese shrapnel. These wounded later received Purple Hearts, originally reserved for service members wounded by enemy action while partaking in armed conflicts for their peacetime actions that day. Uh, on June 13th, 1944, the 3 firefighters killed did not receive theirs until December 7th, 1984, at the 43rd anniversary of the attack.
Wow.
This made the 9 men the only non-military firefighters to ever receive such an award in U.S. history.
Kind of cool.
Yeah.
It's lucky it took so long to get it, though.
No kidding. Yeah. What was your guys' waiting problem?
The U.S. government and all its red tape.
All the red tape in the world. Now, already damaged by a torpedo and on fire amidships, the Nevada attempted to exit the harbor. She was targeted by many Japanese bombers as she got underway and sustained more hits from 250-pound bombs, which started further fires. She was deliberately beached to avoid blocking the harbor entrance. California was hit by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes. The crew might have kept her afloat, but were ordered to abandon ship just as they were raising power from the pumps. Burning oil from the Arizona and the West Virginia drifted down to her, on her, and probably made the situation look worse than it was. The disarmed target ship Utah was holed twice by torpedoes. West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes, the 7th tearing away its rudder. Yeah. The Oklahoma was hit by 4 torpedoes, and the last 2 above her belt armor, which caused her to capsize. Maryland was hit by 2 of the converted 16-inch shells, but neither caused serious damage. Although the Japanese concentrated on battleships, the largest vessel's presence, they did not ignore other targets. The light cruiser Helena was torpedoed, and the concussion from the blast capsized the neighboring mine layer Oglala. 2 destroyers in dry docks, the Cass and the Downs, were destroyed when bombs penetrated their fuel bunkers. The leaking fuel caught fire, flooding the dry dock. In an effort to fight fire, made the burning oil rise, and both were burned out. Cassin slipped from her keel blocks and rolled against Downs. The light cruiser Raleigh was holed by a torpedo. The light cruiser Honolulu was damaged but remained in service. The repair vessel Vestal, moored alongside the Arizona, was heavily damaged and beached. The seaplane tender Curtis was also damaged. The destroyer Shaw was badly damaged when 2 bombs penetrated her forward magazine. Of the 402 American aircraft in Hawaii, 188 of them were destroyed and 159 damaged. 155 of them were on the ground. Almost none were actually ready to take off to defend the base. 8th enemy Air Force pilots managed to get airborne during the attack, and 6 were credited with downing at least 1 Japanese aircraft during the attack. First Lieutenant Lewis M. Sanders, Second Lieutenant Philip M. Rasmussen, Second Lieutenant Kenneth M. Taylor, Second Lieutenant George S. Welsh, Second Lieutenant Harry W. Brown, and Second Lieutenant Gordon H. Sterling, Jr. Of 33 PBYs in Hawaii, 30 were destroyed and 3 in patrol at the time of the attack returned undamaged. Friendly fire brought down some of the planes on top of that, including 4 from an inbound flight from the Enterprise. At the time of the attack, 9 civilian aircraft were flying in the vicinity of Pearl Harbor. Of these, 3 were shot down. Now, the Japanese, 55 Japanese airmen and 9 submariners were killed in the attack, and 1, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured. Of Japan's 414 available planes, 350 took part in the raid, in which 29 were lost, 9 in the first wave, and 20 in the second wave, with another 74 damaged by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Now, according to some accounts, Japan junior officers, including Fuchida and Genda, urged Nagumo to carry out a 3rd strike in order to sink more of Pearl Harbor's remaining warships, damage the base maintenance shops, dry dock facilities, and the oil tank yards. Most notably, Fuchida gave a first-hand account of the meeting several times after the war. However, some historians have cast doubt on this, and many of others Fuchida's later claims, which sometimes conflict with the documented historic records. Genda, who had penned during the planning for the attack without an invasion, 3 strikes were necessary to fully disable the Pacific Fleet, denied requesting an additional attack. Regardless, it is undisputed that the captains of the other 5 carriers in the task force reported that they were willing and ready to carry out a 3rd strike soon after the 2nd return, but Nagumo decided to withdraw for several reasons. First of all, the American anti-aircraft performance had improved considerably during the 2nd strike. and 2/3 of Japan's losses were incurred during the second wave. Nagumo felt that if he launched a third strike, he would be risking 3/4 of the combined fleet's strength to wipe out the remaining targets, including the facilities, while suffering higher aircraft losses. The location of the American carriers was still unknown. In addition, the admiral was now concerned about how his force was within range of American land-based bombers. Nagumo was uncertain whether the U.S. had enough surviving planes remaining on Hawaii to launch an attack against his carriers, and a third wave would have required substantial preparation and turnaround time, and would have meant returning planes would have to land at night. At the time, only the Royal Navy had developed night carrier techniques, so this was a substantial risk. The first two waves launched the entirety of the combined fleet's air strength. A third wave would have required landing both the first and second wave before launching the first wave again. Comparing Nagumo's situation in the Battle of Midway, where the attack returning from Midway kept Nagumo from launching an immediate strike on American carriers. The task force fuel situation did not permit him much time to remain in the waters north of Pearl Harbor much longer, since he was at the very limited logistical support. To do so risked running unacceptably low on fuel, perhaps even having to abandon destroyers on the route home. He also believed that the second strike had essentially accomplished the mission's main objective, neutralizing the fleet, and he did not wish to risk further losses. Moreover, it was the Navy's practice to prefer the conservation of strength over the total destruction of the enemy. Now,
destroy the enemy!
Yes. Although the hypothetical third strike would likely have focused on the base's remaining warships, military historians have suggested that any potential damage to the shore facilities would have hampered the U.S. Pacific fleets far more seriously. If they had been wiped out, the serious operations of the Pacific would have been postponed by more than a year, according to Chester Nimitz, later Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. It would have prolonged the war by another 2 years. At a conference aboard his flagship the following morning, Yamato supported Nagumo's withdrawal without launching a third wave. In retrospect, sparing the vital dockyards, maintenance shops, the oil tank farm meant the U.S. could respond relatively quickly to Japan's activities in the Pacific. Yamato later regretted Nagumo's decision to withdraw and categorically stated it had been a great mistake not to order the third strike. Now, 21 American ships had been damaged or lost in the attack. Interestingly enough, all but 3 were repaired and returned to service.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Going through the battleship loss record, the Arizona was hit by 4 armor-piercing bombs, exploded, total loss 1,177 dead. Oklahoma, hit by 5 torpedoes and capsized, total loss 429 dead. The West Virginia, hit by 2 bombs, 7 torpedoes and sunk, would return to service in July of 1944, 106 dead. California, hit by 2 bombs, 2 torpedoes sunk, returned to service January 1944, 100 dead. Nevada, hit by 6 bombs and 1 torpedo, was beached, returned to service October 1942, 60 dead. The Pennsylvania, in the dry dock with Cassin and Downs, hit by 1 bomb and debris from the Cassin, remained in the service, 9 died. The Tennessee, hit by 2 bombs, returned to service in February 1942, 5 dead. And the Maryland, hit by 2 bombs, returned to service in February 1942, 4 dead, including a float plane pilot who was shot down. In the Utah, ex-battleship, hit by 2 torpedoes, capsized, total loss, 64 dead. The cruisers Helena, hit by 1 torpedo, was returned to service in January 1942. The Raleigh, hit by 1 torpedo, returned to service in February 1942. The Honolulu, a near miss, light damage, remained in service. The Cassin was in dry dock, hit by 1 bomb, burned, reconstructed, and returned to service in February 1944. Downs, in dry dock with Cassin in the Pennsylvania, caught fire with Cassin, burned, reconstructed, and returned to service in 1943. The Helm, on her way to West Block, damaged by 2 near-miss bombs, continued patrol, dry docked in 1942 and January 15th. 5 days later was sailing again. The Shaw, hit by 3 bombs, was returned to service in June of 1942. The mine layler Oglala, damaged by a torpedo and Helena, capsized and returned to service as an engine repair ship in February of 1944. The Vestal, hit by 2 bombs, blast and fire from the Arizona, was beached and returned to service in August of 1942. The Curtis was hit by 1 bomb and crashed Japanese aircraft, returned to service in January. 19 died. The Sotoyomo, a harbor tug, was damaged by an explosion and fires in the Shaw, sunk and returned to service in August of 42. And a YFD yard floating dock was damaged by bombs and sunk and returned to service the following January to service the Shaw. Now, interesting enough, for all the ships that the Japanese knocked out, the U.S. Navy had just the right guy that they needed to start what was basically one of the largest salvage operations in the war. Captain Homer N. Wallen was ordered to lead a formal salvage operation, and around Pearl Harbor, divers from the Navy, shore and tenders, the Pacific Harbor Naval Shipyard, and civilian contractors began work on the ships that could be refloated. They began work by patching holes, clearing debris, and pumping out water from the ships. Navy divers worked inside the damaged ships, and within 6 months, 5 of the battleships and 2 cruisers were patched and refloated so they could be sent to the shipyards in Pearl Harbor and the mainland for extensive repair. Intensive salvage operations continued for another year. A total of 20,000 man hours underwater. Many orders. Sadly, the Arizona and the target ship Utah were too heavily damaged for salvage and remained where they sank, with the Arizona becoming a war memorial. The Oklahoma, which was successfully raised, was never repaired and capsized while under tow to the mainland in 1947. The Nevada proved particularly difficult to raise and repair. 2 men involved in the operation died after inhaling poisonous gases that had accumulated in the ship's interior. When feasible, armament and equipment were removed from vessels too damaged to repair and put to use aboard other aircraft. Now, going back to the Japanese and the third effort wing that they wanted to use, the 2 things that surprised me off of this, and they were correct. First of all, by not going after the oil farm, the oil tanks, okay, that gave us chances to rebuild, retrofit, and get stuff working again. Had the Japanese gone ahead with that third strike, they seriously could have crippled most of the United States Navy in the Pacific at that time. The big thing to think about also is that if the aircraft carriers were out of the harbor and they were able to destroy the oil supplies, those aircraft carriers could be in for a severe time trying to get resupplied. Now, the one thing also that's also kind of interesting is that when Japan decided to do this strike, while it was surgical, there never was any transports with this fleet. So they weren't looking to capture Hawaii or any of the islands. They primarily were looking at, to send a message, bloody our nose, say, now that we've destroyed your fleet, you want to come back to the table.
No.
Exactly.
Bad Japanese.
And it pretty much all across the board, it pissed us off. Also, the rumor that Yamamoto made the phrase that I fear that all we have done is woke a sleeping tiger and filled it with a horrible resolve. Nobody's ever been able to prove that he actually said that, but it's pretty accurate. Because by what they did, it really freaking pissed us off. And of course, in the aftermath, the day after the attack, Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech to a joint session of Congress calling for the formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan. Congress obliged the request less than an hour later. Now, interestingly enough, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States even though the Tripartite Pact did not require it. Congress issued a declaration of war against Japan and Italy later the same day. The United Kingdom had already been at war with Germany since September of 1939 and with Italy since June of 1940. Winston Churchill had promised to declare war within an hour of the Japanese attack on the United States. Upon learning of the Japanese attacks on Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong, Churchill promptly determined that there was no need to wait for or to further consult with the U.S. government and immediately summoned the Japanese ambassador. Oh, you? And UK declared war on Japan 9 hours before the U.S. did.
Oops.
So when you want to piss off the whole frickin' planet, this is what they pulled off. The attack was an initial shock to all the Allies in the Pacific theater. Further losses compounded the alarming setback. And as we know, Japan attacked the Philippines hours later because of the time difference, December the 8th of the Philippines. Only 3 days after the attack of Pearl Harbor, the battleships of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were sunk off the coast of Malaya, causing Churchill to later to recollect, in all the war I've never received more a direct shock. As I turned and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or in the Pacific except to the American survivors of the Pearl Harbor who were hastening back to California. Over this expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked. Throughout the war, Pearl Harbor was frequently used in American propaganda, very effectively because, well, again, they kind of bloodied our noses and filled us with a horrible resolve to go make matters right. But that was what happened December 7th, 1941, and it basically gave America a good shove to get into the war. And 1945, we would win World War II. But this is Joe for the Mud Files, giving you a rather long introduction to the December 7th day.
That was an introduction?
Yes.
When's the real class?
Real class will be in a couple weeks. Be sure to take notes because we probably will have a pop quiz.
Woo!
So, the Bearded One, the historian, you folks have a good day and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Boy, you boy.